Student debt makes me feel depressed, ashamed, disappointed, cheated. These are just a few of the emotions that student loan borrowers experience on a daily basis. This word cloud was provided to me by the thousands of stories that my organization, studentdebtcrisis.org, has received over the years. And it's from the almost million supporters that we have and their stories that drive me to speak about this and work on this topic every single day. And when I travel the country, the very first thing I want to know is, how many of you have college debt? So show of hands, how many folks in this room still have college debt? And you're not alone. More than 1 in 5 adult Americans have student loan debt. And they're not holding millions or billions, but trillions. 1.6 trillion, in fact. Actually, 1,685,397,167,995. It's a mouthful to say, let alone pay off. And this is held by 45 million Americans. And to put this into perspective, this is more than the GDP of 175 countries. We add more than $2,850 per second. Another 28. Another 28. So how did I get started? Why am I here speaking to you today about this issue? Well, I went back to school a little later in life. I was called a non-traditional student. That means any student over 25. Which, what is a traditional student anyways? And I was one of the first graduating classes during the Great Recession. I graduated in 2009. We had hire me on our caps. There were no longer college recruiters. And at the same exact time, the University of California system, I went to UCLA, decided to raise tuition 30% or more than 30% from one semester to the next. This meant that friends and colleagues of mine were scrambling and struggling to figure out how to pay for their senior year. And in fact, 2 of them dropped out. Well, flash forward to 2013, I started my organization. I'd been researching this topic for years. And we were joined by dozens and dozens of coalitions and different organizations, from labor organizations, grassroots, think tanks, and all types of nonprofits. And we collectively agreed and noticed the writing was on the wall. Student debt is a crisis. This is a crisis whether you have debt or not. The domino effect that's going on right now for student loan borrowers who are struggling to pay or even making their payments is that they can't afford to buy houses. And that's what the National Association of Realtors says. They can't afford to get a new car, start a business, contribute to the overall economy. So if you have a house to sell or a product to sell, or you just generally care about the economy like most of us do, this is impacting you too. So let's address the elephants in the room, from maybe here or out there. The very first thing I hear, at least the devil's advocate approach or contrarian, is, well, you signed on the dotted line. You knew what you were getting into. If only if it could be that simple. Well, we know that more than 2/3 leave college with debt. What I think people don't know is that hardly anyone's in the right repayment program. If you have federal student loans, no one should ever be in default. But as you can see, we're adding 1 million defaults per year. What is student loan default? Well, it's kind of like bankruptcy, but much worse. They garnish a portion of your paycheck. They take away some of your Social Security. They take all of your tax returns. Trust me, the federal government will get their money back. And it's just gotten to the point that this system that feels complex by design is so hard to understand what program you can get into that you now need a class. You have to go back to school to understand how to pay your student loans. Or you have to attend one of our workshops or one of our fellow organizations' workshops for an hour and a half and get financially educated on this topic that people with master's degrees and PhDs are struggling to understand. So, where did this get started? Student loans as we know it. We have to go all the way back to 1965 and President Lyndon Johnson's Higher Education Act. Now, there were student loans before this, largely connected to military, because our country has actually always felt that education is vital to our national security. But in 1965, President Johnson strongly believed that all Americans should be able to go to college. They should be able to have it be affordable, have it be accessible, and quality should not be compromised. Unfortunately, during this time, there was this looming student debt crisis. Now Johnson's idea worked. We saw more people of color, more lower income communities, and more women go to college. In fact, by the early 80s, women surpassed men in going to college. But remember, that student debt crisis was just getting started. And to give you some perspective, when I got my organization started in 2012, student loan debt was at $1 trillion. In only 7 years, we've added almost $700 billion. That's almost $100 billion per year. And one of the people that are experiencing or part of that 100 billion is my friend Olivia. Now you'll notice Olivia's name's in quotes, and that's because Olivia feels the shame and stigma of student loan debt, especially because she's defaulted. Olivia's a mom. Olivia is a nonprofit worker. She's dedicated her life to public service. But it wasn't until Olivia started working on this issue, as she described, she's a self-taught borrower, that she could finally get out of default and start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Olivia had to choose between putting food on the table or paying her student loans, or paying for her children's needs, or paying for student loans. What would you choose? And when she called her loan servicer, in our world, that's what the debt collectors are called. Kind of a sweet name for a not-so-sweet job. That when Olivia called her loan servicer, she wasn't told that there were special programs for people in public service, or that there were repayment programs, and all that led her into default. And Olivia, one thing I forgot to mention, is African American. Now, the only reason I mention this is because Black women hold the most amount of student loan debt in our country. And unfortunately now we are seeing student debt be a civil rights issue. College is no longer affordable. We see tuition increases left and right in multiple states. It's no longer accessible. The average federal loan amount doesn't even pay for 4 years at a state college in most states. And probably one of the most heartbreaking things for me is that for centuries, we have seen African Americans not be able to build generational wealth. And now, because of going to college, this thing that was supposed to be a great equalizer It's now the exact opposite, and future generations are experiencing what those experienced in the centuries before them. And it's not just people of color, it's not just low income, it's not just women, it's everyone in every generation. Did you know there's more people over the age of 30 than under that have student loan debt? Are you okay with more than 200,000 senior citizens having a portion of their Social Security taken away because they're defaulted? What do you think of when you picture somebody with student loan debt? I often hear that they think of the kid playing beer pong and getting drunk and being crazy. Do you think of Max? Do you think of the 62-year-old veteran minister? Max also works for the city in California. And Max has $320,000 in student loan debt. When I met Max at the state capitol, because Max was brave enough to testify and share his story in front of lawmakers, Max told me that he will never pay this loan off in his lifetime. And this is the only loan he's never been able to pay off. And it breaks his heart. So oddly, with all that, I'm optimistic. Working in this space and researching this issue for almost 10 years now, I can tell you, when I first started, we didn't hear any lawmakers talking about this. It was only the people affected by student loan debt that were talking about it. No one was calling it a crisis. And now, from Senator Elizabeth Warren to Senator Marco Rubio, student debt knows no political party. It doesn't discriminate whether you're Democrat or Republican. And finally, we're seeing action on the state level, the local level, and the federal level. So if we can all just take a moment to just imagine a world without student loan debt. I finally can. I paid mine off just a few weeks ago. But it can't just be these individuals. We all collectively need a reprieve from that $1.6 trillion of debt. And we asked our student loan borrowers, and they said that they could volunteer, retire, have hope. Many people I talked to say they can just breathe. And it's from our supporters and the millions of student loan borrowers in this country sharing their stories and speaking up that has driven me and so many of my colleagues to work and care about this issue. So my one ask to you is, if you have student loan debt, is to share it with your lawmakers, your state lawmakers, your federal lawmakers, journalists, your mother, father, brother, sister, because the more we get our story out there, the harder it is for them to ignore us. Because we can't become complacent. Remember that $2,800 per second? This is how we've added $2.5 million just in this time I've been speaking. So I'll ask you one last thing. How much more do we need to add before you take action? Thank you.